Hi there, Davey Cretin here for Cretin Classics, and this is another episode of Behind the Counter, Tales from the Record Store, episode number 3, and I'm going to talk about a place I used to work at for many, many years. It was called Titus Oaks CD and Record Exchange, and I started there in the fall of 1988. And I was there through the 90s. The name changed to something else, but more on that in another episode. Now, Titus Oaks is named after the nickname for my former boss at the time. Alan Meltzer was Titus. And throughout our years, we referred to him as Titus. That was his nickname. A lot of people in the industry just called him Titus, not Alan Meltzer. Alan was born in 1944. Unfortunately, he passed away on Halloween, October 31st, 2011, at the age of 67. Like me, he's a New Yorker. I'm from Queens, like my father. Alan was from Brooklyn, and he actually started out as a pretzel vendor on the streets of Brooklyn, believe it or not. So you too could start out as a pretzel vendor in Brooklyn and become a multimillionaire like Titus did. I mean, this guy led a real fascinating life. Started out with a record store in Brooklyn called Titus Oaks Records. Of course, later on, he opened stores in Hicksville, Long Island. That's where I started working first. And then Huntington, Long Island. Eventually, he moved to Connecticut from the city to Connecticut. He opened up a store in Connecticut called Rainbow Records. So at one time, he had 3 or 4 different record stores going at once. Started the Brooklyn store. By the time I started working for him, the Brooklyn store was closed and he had already moved to Connecticut. So he lived in Connecticut with his wife, Diana Meltzer. More on her in a little bit because she figures very prominently into the story. Now, just before they disappear from my iPad here, see if I could show you some quick pictures. There we go. Over here, get to the tall guy with the little beard, Mark Tremonti, the guitar player from Creed, Tremonti, and of course, Alter Bridge. Here in the middle is Alan Meltzer, a.k.a. Titus. And over here, Scott Stapp from Creed. So he's responsible for signing Creed. Alan Meltzer there in the middle. Now to show you a quick picture of his wife. She's responsible for signing Creed and Evanescence. So there's a picture of Amy Lee from Evanescence. And there's Diana Meltzer. Now, I had a memory of her when I met her wearing some kind of crazy hat with fruit on it. And when you look up Diana Meltzer on the internet, you find pictures of her. She's known for her hats. So my memory was correct because she is wearing kind of a funky hat in this picture, if you can see it there. Okay, so that's a picture of Diana Meltzer and Alan Meltzer. Let me put my iPad away. I'm recording on my phone for better sound. So, Alan had a few times tried to start a record company. Unfortunately, unsuccessfully. He tried with like a dance 12-inch company I remember hearing about back in the day when he was in Brooklyn. That never took off. So he always wanted to conquer the music biz. And obviously from the pictures I showed you, he and his wife eventually did once they had wind-up records. But more about that in a minute. So he had started out in Brooklyn, opened up the 2 stores on Long Island. That's where I started working. In Hicksville, eventually I went to Huntington. I worked out of both for a while, ping-ponging back and forth. He opened the record store in Connecticut called Rainbow Records. That's where Diana worked. She ran Rainbow Records in Connecticut. Also at the time in Connecticut, he opened up CD One Stop. Now, CD One Stop at the time became a famous record distributor. And he started it in the mid to late 80s when CDs were becoming popular and all kinds of old records were being reissued on CD. So he cornered the market, and he had the first computerized CD distributor in America. Because I remember when I first started working at Titus, we used to write out the orders. My boss used to write out the orders by hand. There was a sheet of paper, and you write the title, the label, the code number, and do the orders that way. Then we'd fax them over to Connecticut. Eventually, it became computerized. And that's when he really started taking off. He's taking orders from all over America, and the distributorship became huge. So by then, Brooklyn had closed. He had Rainbow Records in Connecticut, the two stores, Titus Oaks CD and Record Exchange on Long Island. That's where I started in late 1988. Now, once he became computerized, he became one of the largest wholesalers of CDs in the 80s, late 80s, and 90s. In 1993, he sold CD One Stop to another company called Alliance Entertainment for $30 million. That was when he had his first giant windfall. Also around this time, he invested, after that windfall, he invested $1.2 million in a company called CD Now. And when that company went public later on, he made $25 million, his second windfall. Now, once he sold the distributorship in 1993, and he sold our two stores to his friend, more on that in another episode, he purchased for a little less than $1 million, for $950,000, he and Diana, his wife at the time, purchased Grass Records, which was a small independent label. Now, this label had a lot of bands that not too many people knew. It was alternative rock and punk, because after all, this is the 90s we're talking about. He had bands like Edsel, the Rugburns, the Wrens, W-R-E-N-S, and Baboon. Now, I remember one of my coworkers, because we had promo CDs for all these bands, really liked the band called the Rugburns. And they had a good song called Lockjaw, and the chorus was, "Got lockjaw, can't tell you that I love you." Good song by the Rugburns back in the day. And the singer, whose name escapes me right now, eventually went on to co-write some songs with Jewel for her debut album. So he ended up, making some good money working with Jewel, some of that Jewel Kilcher money from back in the 90s. Getting back to the story, so Alan and Diana purchased Grass Records in 95, still looking for that elusive, successful record label. Unfortunately, the label failed to gain any steam. I remember they put out a double CD collection where all these alternative bands, there were about 30 bands on the roster for Grass Records, covered Sinatra songs. And we had boxes and boxes of this double CD in a double slimline jewel case of all these alt-rock bands covering Sinatra songs. And we had giveaways. If you spent X amount of money in the store, you'd get a free CD, and it was this double disc of mainly bands you've never heard of covering Sinatra songs. Forgot to put that in my notes, so that was just from memory. Grass was a failure. They reactivated it a little while later and changed the name to Wind Up Records. And that is where Diana Meltzer actually got the nickname, the Woman with the Golden Ears. She started out as a fashion model. She got together with Alan, married him. She became a record company executive from 1996 until the present day. So it's a long time, nearly 30 years. She was a record executive at Wind Up Records from 1996 to 2009, and now she works with a company called Monster Hits Music from 2011 to the present. I mean, starting out as a fashion model and becoming a music mogul, nice career trajectory, definitely. Like I said, she co-owned and operated Rainbow Records in Connecticut, and in 2004, she became the first woman to top Hit Quarter's World Top 100 A&R chart, which is big kudos in a male-dominated industry for a woman, and she was topped the charts alongside Dr. Dre, whom everyone's heard the name Dr. Dre, famous rapper and record mogul. Clive Davis, everyone knows him from Arista Records and from CBS, Sony, Columbia, whatever you want to call that. And Tommy Mottola, of course, who was married to the great Mariah Carey. So she was in good company indeed. She made a name for herself as a record executive. More on that in a few minutes. Going back to talking about Alan, so when they reactivated Wind Up Records, Diana's the one who heard Creed, heard it, their first album they recorded on their own called My Own Prison, and she said, oh, these guys sound great. I want to sign them, but let's go down to Florida and see them. So she and Alan, her husband, and the guy whose name escapes me, who was running Wind Up Records, was like the guy in charge of Wind Up Records. They were the co-owners. Went down to Florida. Diana saw the band. She said, this is an arena band, hearing the way Mark Tremonti played guitar. And when Scott Stapp stepped up to the microphone, wow, say that 3 times fast, she heard that voice and she said, this band is going to be huge. That's why they call her. I mean, I know Quincy Jones is called the man with the golden ears. She's known in the industry as the woman with the golden ears. She said, we got to sign these guys. They're going to be huge. And if you remember, in the late 90s and early 2000s, Creed were a huge band. Eventually, they were so big, and Scott Stapp's ego allegedly got so big that they became hated, and a lot of people looked down on them. But Creed sold millions of records. I remember we had boxes of promo CDs for the debut Creed album and the follow-up Human Clay. But those records were like sold 3-4 million copies. So Creed were a huge band. Next, she heard a demo of a band, I think also from Florida, from down south, called Evanescence. And she said, Amy Lee's voice, this is going to be the next band. She saw them and decided that they needed some work. She signed the band by hearing Amy Lee's voice. She knew the song, she heard her singing the song My Immortal. My Immortal was a hit from the debut Evanescence album. But the song that really broke them was called Bring Me to Life. It was Alan Meltzer's idea to put the rap in the song, the male voice, as the counterpoint to Amy Lee's female vocals. So between the two of them, they brought up these huge bands, Evanescence to the public, Creed to the public, and both bands were million-selling bands in the late 90s and early 2000s. Also, you guys probably out there have heard of the band Seether. They were on Wind Up Records, Finger 11. I mean, they had songs. One of the soundtracks to one of the Spider-Man movies was on Wind Up Records, and it had all these alt-rock artists. And that probably sold 500,000, 1 million copies, the soundtrack to one of the Spider-Man movies. I think it was one of the Tobey Maguire movies. At any rate, so Alan also became a poker enthusiast. And he made multiple TV appearances, and I saw him when I was watching late night TV after the talk shows I used to watch on NBC. They showed one of these poker shows, and I had met Alan Meltzer a couple of times. He was down to Titus Oaks, and I once went to a party in Connecticut that he and his wife held, a Christmas party for the company, and that's when I saw her with the hat with the fruit in it and said, oh, she's an exotic lady, because who's known for wearing hats with fruit? Carmen Miranda. And Diana Meltzer was the second most famous person to do that. So Alan, getting back to Alan, he made multiple TV appearances on game show networks, TV show called High Stakes Poker and Full Tilt Poker's Poker After Dark. That's the one that NBC reran. I was watching Poker After Dark when I saw him. And he still looked like Alan, maybe slightly older, but he was still that short guy with the cherubic face and the big smile. He was always very personable, and everyone liked his personality. I mean, he could be, from what I read, he was a tough negotiator. If you were negotiating with him, you didn't want to negotiate with him because he was a tough nut to crack. Now, they were married together and married for a while, Alan and Diana. Unfortunately, in 2010, sometimes all good things come to an end. They got a divorce in 2010. By this time, he had sold Wind Up Records, and he was offered like $100 million at one point by a major label. He refused to sell it for $100 million. Another time, he was offered $60 million. He refused again to sell Wind Up because he wanted to be indie. He wanted to do things his way without someone over him, an overlord, saying, you got to do this, you got to do that. Another time he was offered $30 million and still refused to sell Wind Up Records. He actually sold it for less money to his friends who were running the company. So that's what kind of guy he was. He was a good guy. I mean, I didn't have much contact with him, but he was beloved within the industry, even though he was a tough negotiator. So in 2010, the couple got divorced. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, Alan passed away in 2011, Halloween 2011. Pardon me, I just needed a sip of water. Just taped another show before this, so I could tell my voice is starting to go. Now, before their divorce, Diana was entitled to 33%, a third of her husband's $10 million estate. So obviously, even though he'd sold CD Now and made $25 million, sold CD One Stop to Alliance and made $30 million, because he was a gambler, I guess his net worth went up and down. Because you win big, you lose big when you're a poker player. So his estate was $10 million, but once they got divorced, Diana wasn't entitled to any of that money. Now, when he passed away, surprisingly, and these were the headlines in the papers at the time, he gave $1.5 million of his inheritance he gave $1 million to his driver, I guess his limo driver, town car driver, a guy named Jean Laborde. He was 54 years old at the time. He was a father of 5 who lived in, I think, New Jersey, and worked for Alan and only had nice things to say about him. And also his doorman at his building left $500,000 to that guy. I'm going to try to pronounce his name. Shamil Demiraj, Chamil, last name Demiraj. And both guys spoke very highly of him. They were happy that they were in his will and totally surprised that they got left money in his will. But they said he was a great guy. And from what I read, when he was going through a bad time divorcing Diana, he allegedly cried on their shoulders, and they were his confidants. So he was friends with a common man. He didn't look at anyone as higher in class status than someone else. He treated everyone equally and the same, and he was well admired for that. And just leaving the money to his chauffeur, to his driver, whichever you want to call it, and his doorman, that made headlines at the time. Now, here's the fascinating part. Diana Meltzer is quoted by the New York Post. She was interviewed, and this is what she said, quote, "If he wants to give his money to the bums, he can give it to the bums. He could fuck a nun. I couldn't give a shit. We're divorced. The man is dead." Boom, plain and simple like that. She didn't really want to answer the questions that she was being asked at the time. I guess they had a very contentious divorce, and everyone's a little hot under the collar, so to speak, after a divorce. So that's who I worked for back in the day. Alan Meltzer and Diana Meltzer, and they co-owned Titus Oaks Record and CD Exchange. And some of you out there might remember, because I used to get told a lot in my later jobs, "Oh, when I was a teenager, you sold me my first Iron Maiden cassette. All your cassettes were locked behind these glass cabinets, and you had to get the key that was attached to a chicken to open the cassette cabinets." And yes, we did. We had a little plastic chicken attached to the key to open the cassette cabinets. So I had people tell me that when I worked at Mr. Cheapo's and Music Arcade. "Hey, when I was 10 years old, you sold me my first Maiden cassette, my first Metallica cassette," things like that back in the day. But that's the story of Diana Meltzer and Alan Meltzer. Unfortunately, Alan has passed on, And Diana is still a record company executive to this very day. The woman with the golden ears. Thank you for watching, everyone. Like, subscribe, comment below if you remember me from Titus Oaks or any other of my record store jobs. Comment below. And always remember to rock out, prog on, and pogo. Thank you very much. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And I will see you in my next video. Take care, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.